Uh, Interpersonal relationships is really looking at the team dynamics and how each of the different profiles are going to work together. Now, typically when we work with a team, we spend some time working with the coaches in terms of helping them to understand their profiles, and I assume if you're part of the Women's Coach Academy, then you may have had an opportunity to do your coach DISC profile, and so you may have an understanding of DISC. But what's really interesting is looking at the overall team dynamics and how each of the athletes fit into one element or one aspect of that DISC model, and then looking at what is the representation of our Ds, our Is, our S's and our Cs. And what we're looking for there is, do we have perhaps an over-representation of certain styles? For example, if we have an over-representation of Ds, we can almost be assured that we're going to have a higher level of potential conflict. Why? Because Ds are relatively conflict averse, and they don't see conflict as being a personal issue between people. They just see conflict as perhaps it's a challenge, or it's a situation where you might be holding another athlete account for something, or you're upholding high standards of performance, and the most important thing is achieving those outcomes. And so if you have a lot of Ds in your team, that's going to give rise to potentially a little bit more conflict. But the good news for most of you as coaches is that the reality is that we often don't get enough Ds, and so it's not one of the profiles which is the most prevalent profile. By the same token, if we think about conflict, there was a team that I was involved with a few years back, and the team, when they came together, and even me understanding all of these things that I understand, and the coaches who are looking after this team understanding these concepts as well, when the team came together as in that forming stage, they were able to produce some pretty good results pretty quickly, mainly because people are enthusiastic, they're keen, and they're highly adaptable. And the coaches didn't actually sit down and structure what we're talking about today, but in their own way had a way of navigating their way through the season, and have done very successfully in the past. So they had their own system and process. But what was really interesting with that team was that as the season progressed, the athletes never went through a storming stage. They never had big issues with each other, even little issues with each other. There are occasionally a couple of small things, but on the whole, when we looked at that group as a group of athletes, we always felt that they just got on really well, and they had some great relationships and some really good bonds, up until the point where they didn't perform very well in their most important competition for the year. And what we noticed was happening was that as that competition progressed, their performance actually began to decline over the space of that time frame. And it was when the performances were all said and done and the competition had finished that a lot of the conflicts started to come out into the open, and that there were some major conflicts between the different generations of athletes which were represented on the team. Now, we as coaches weren't aware of any of these things at the time, and for me it was a very good lesson that if your team has been together for a period of time and it hasn't gone through a storming stage, you think that they might be getting along great, but the reality is that they probably haven't gone through that stage yet, or we haven't created the opportunity for them to go through that stage. And I always find it's interesting, because this is obviously related very much to any relationship that you may be part of. And certainly whether it's with marriage counselling or relationship counselling or any of those type of things, in order to make a relationship stronger, you need to sort out what your similarities and what your differences are. And sometimes you actually need to facilitate that. And so part of this process is when athletes have completed their DISC profile, as a team we encourage the coaches to spend time with their players to make sure that over the space of time, and I know this is something that Holly does very well with her players, but over the space of time you get the athletes to actually share what their respective profile is, and you get them to be aware of the fact that, well, if one's a D and one's a C, there's going to be some element of potential conflict which is naturally going to exist between them. And this is the really interesting thing about team dynamics, is that there absolutely will be conflict, and there should be, because there's natural conflict within each of the elements of that DISC model. So that's what we want to have a look at now. If we look at DISC as a tool, even if we just look at this big picture example of DISC here, what we find is that you've got your D's, your I's, your S's and your C's. Now if you look at this model and look at the axes on this model, so the y-axis was saying that the C's and D's are more closed and task focused, the S's and I's being more open and people orientated. We're going to flesh out a little bit more what this means, but essentially we're going to get conflict between when we have the C's and D's being more closed and task focused, so guarded and task focused. They will potentially have conflict with the S's and I's, who have a very different style for them, being open and people orientated. Even if that may look like on the field, when you turn up to practice, you're going to have athletes that are turning up purely because they want to achieve an outcome at practice, that they want to get the job done, they want to get on with the task of training, whatever the case may be, improving their technique. Then it's not that the S's and the I's don't want to do that, it's just that they also have as a priority that need to build relationships. And so the C's and D's won't talk as much as what the S's and I's will. And if the athletes don't know that they are a different disc style, the S's and I's will perceive the C's and D's as being perhaps a little bit rude or abrupt or not interested in them as people. By the same token, the C's and the D's are going to perceive the S's and I's as being not switched on. Now, I'm pretty certain that all of you would have seen examples of this in practice, and I certainly recall from my own days as an athlete when I was rowing in a lot of different crews. Even the very first rowing crews that I was in, I always, my profile, I had a lot of D in my profile, and still do, but understand how to adapt that now. And at the time, I didn't know much about this, and when I turned up and participated in my teams, I was very much a disciplined style of athlete. I was the youngest athlete ever to make my respective Olympic team here in Australia, and there was a reason for that. It was because I was so focused on the goals that I wanted to achieve. And when I was on a team with another group of athletes, obviously we had a diversity of athletes, and not every athlete was a D. In fact, most of them weren't. And I always found myself fulfilling that role of being the one to make sure that everyone else was switched on, and that when we're at practice that we were there to get a job done. But there were plenty of times when I overstepped those boundaries and certainly created some level of conflict for myself and the other people in my team. And so it wasn't really until I appreciated how everyone was different that I was able to build better relationships. And why that is so important is that teams need to establish what I call these strong emotional bonds. And if you establish strong emotional bonds which are based on trust and respect, which is the foundation to any quality relationship, then you are more able to have what we would consider to be a crucial or a tough or an honest conversation with each other. And so if we understand each other well, we're in a better position to do that. So we're going to flick to looking at these in individuality now. And once again, if you have any questions on the DISC model, please feel free to ask them. But dominance is about how directly you approach issues and problems. So whilst there are a lot of different behaviours that go with that D behavioural style, the reality is that it's mainly about how you approach issues, challenges, problems, people and situations. And what we mean by that is the higher the level of D you are, the more directly you're going to approach an issue or a challenge or a problem or a situation. Now what that means at practice is an athlete that turns up who has a lot of D in their profile, as I mentioned about myself, their focus is turning up and thinking about how is today going to help me win my matches this weekend, or how is today going to improve my performance as an athlete. And so I've got the Nike slogan there, and that's basically a way of associating with the D's, and they just say, well, we just do it. We literally just get on with it. And so whilst they are focused on being direct and dealing with things in a very directive way, what that also means is that if they have an issue or a challenge or a situation which they feel they need to deal with, they'll do it without consulting a lot of other people. They'll do it without putting a lot of thought and consideration into the nth degree of planning and details and consequences that may go with dealing with a particular situation. Now, the advantages of that, and there are some significant advantages with that, the advantage is that when the situation needs to be dealt with immediately, so for example, when we talk about conflict and chaos in our team, so if we establish that we're going to use that grip model to set the foundations for our season, so therefore moving forward, we do have some well-established goals and processes and procedures in place, particularly behavioural guidelines and what your expectations are with the team overall. Coaches that are a high D, if they see an athlete or someone on the team step outside of those behavioural guidelines and framework, they're quite likely to address it immediately. So they're not the style of coach who's happy to see that, see those guidelines and those rules and those expectations blur. They want to keep it at a hard edge so that the players clearly understand what is expected of them and what that framework is. Now that's a really positive use of that D style. And the adaptations that a D often needs to make is mainly just around ensuring that they soften their approach to dealing with that issue. So whilst they can deal with something in a very direct and immediate way, the key thing is to do it in still an engaging way, so that at the end of that potential confrontation with a player or a fellow coach or someone else associated with the team is to make sure that that person's self-esteem and confidence and their level of engagement on the team is still intact. Now, if you're a low D style, many of you probably have done your profile. If you're a low D style, it's important to recognise that you will deal with things in a less direct way. Now, what that essentially means is that as a coach, it doesn't mean that you won't deal with them, but it just means that you'll spend more time considering, thinking about what the best plan of action is, potentially discussing with other people, and then doing it in a fairly diplomatic style. Okay, so that's that D style. Now, when we look at team dynamics, what we often find when we look at normal populations, and athletes are a sample of a normal population. What we mean by that is that we have a database with that we have access to with more than 25,000 people in that database. What we find is that roughly 9% of that database have D in their profile, so they're high Ds. And so it's not an overly prolific profile. And so when we talk about conflict within teams, quite often we may end up with maybe only, if we have a team of 12 or 13 people, we may only end up with one D in that team, maybe two. Now, if two Ds are together, you can get a bit of conflict, because some of their conflict can be about, well, who's going to be the leader here? Ds have a natural inclination to want to take a leadership role. They don't necessarily make the best leaders, but they do want to be in a authoritative position. And obviously, if you've got two people who want to take on that role, we go back to what we were talking about with our team roles, the non-technical ones. A non-technical role example is being a leader. And obviously, two Ds could conflict over that. The next one, of course, is the I's, and basically the I scale is the degree to which you are more extroverted or introverted. So the higher the level of I you are, the more extroverted your behaviours are. Now, what we mean by that is that it's where you get your energy from. But typically high I behaviour is more, as it says on the slide, it's enthusiastic, they're talkative, they're social, they're energetic. They bring an enormous amount of the atmosphere to your practice sessions. Now, the issue with the I's is that whilst they bring that great sense of energy and enthusiasm, the main challenge with the I's is that they can have a little bit of trouble focusing and switching on when they need to. And so therefore, it can create some conflict situations with some of the other more task-orientated athletes who really have a feeling that, training is, we turn up to practice because we want to actually get the workload completed, and they don't see it as a social occasion. And there's nothing wrong with that, just the same as there's nothing wrong with our I's being interested in building relationships, because it's those bonds that are going to be created largely through the interaction and networking of our I's, which really can create a strong team for us. Now, if you're a lower I, that basically means that you're more introverted, and so you are more likely to get your energy from within. You're more likely to be a little less talkative, a little less social than what some of the other athletes and players are. Now, obviously, if we mix those two together, they can be points of conflict right there. But once again, if the different athletes on your team understand that these things are different, then the low I's can appreciate the value that the high I's can bring, and the high I's can appreciate the value that the low I's can bring to a team. And so once again, in terms of conflict, it's naturally going to be there. However, if we get to that norming stage of our team's development, it's basically suggesting that our team has got to a stage where they are genuinely valuing the differences that exist between each other, and they're seeing how those differences actually contribute to the team's success.